Hello. So for my research paper, I'm studying the U.S. intervention in Chile and their involvement in the ouster of the democratically elected president Salvador Allende in 1973. And I'm going to be looking at this event as a case study, and I'm going to be asking the question, how did the United States justify its involvement in the overthrow of the democratically elected government, the democratically elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende, in 1973. And I'm going to be studying this from a postcolonial theory lens. And I think that this is a very good lens to study this particular event because I think it is a very comprehensive and telling historical analysis of why it was, how it was that the United States was able to justify its own actions in the affairs of another country. As we know, the United States has a history of involving itself in the affairs of Latin America, in promoting dictators and in kind of treating Latin America as countries that are subject to the will of the United States. And as such, I think that these colonial legacies that we study when we study postcolonial theory are central to understanding how the United States, just as far as justification is concerned, was permitted or allowed itself to do this, felt entitled to do this. So in asking how did the United States justify itself, my tentative answer to this is that the colonial legacy of an Anglo-ethnocentric imperialism bestowed upon the United States the assumption that Latin American countries are inferior and less valid, thereby justifying the U.S. in its excessive involvement in the politics of Chile. Now, as I mentioned, there is absolutely a colonial legacy at play here, and in this paper, I'm looking at the legacies that come about from colonialism and the attitudes that are shaped by said colonialism. And one excellent thing that I've learned as I've been reading what you recommended to me, Professor Anibal Quijano, is a paper that he wrote with Michael Ennis called Coloniality of Power, Eurocentrism, and Latin America. And in this paper, they really explain the origins of this kind of us versus them mentality coming from the colonization of the New World. And so when colonizers would come over and conquistadors came, there was the establishment of this bridge between, or this gap rather, not bridge, gap, between the conquered and the conqueror. And that bridge was often based on race issues and just a sense of even a biological difference between the conquered and the conqueror. And the superiority and inferiority complexes were thereby established. And so we currently live in a world that has these legacies, and I think it's so important that we study these legacies, and I really think it's central in understanding a lot of what happens in U.S. foreign policy when it comes to its engagement with Latin America. And as we know, and as I explained, the U.S. has been involved in supporting various dictators over the years in Latin America, and that but as I was saying about this perception of superiority, I think that one thing I found that I thought was very telling of this sense of superiority comes from one of our presidents, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, I believe, kind of set the attitude for how the U.S. Views other countries in Latin America. And when describing Texans who were trying to keep at bay Mexicans who were living in Texas, Roosevelt explains that it was, quote, out of the question to expect them Texans to submit to the mastery of the weaker race. And this is Theodore Roosevelt, describing issues between Mexicans and Texans at the time, battles and various conflicts that were occurring. And so it's pretty striking to hear our president describe that. And there are other instances where Theodore Roosevelt in particular has talked about kind of the expansionist, imperialist nature of America and how great it is, and how European blood, white European blood expanding all over the world and bringing with it its ideologies is a gift to all of humanity. And so this is a colonial legacy, undoubtedly, and it continues, and it definitely applies to the case of the United States' involvement in Chile as far as how it was that it justified itself. And so I think that there are advantages and disadvantages to using this theory. I described the advantages. I personally, but I will continue to describe some more. I think that it truly is the most comprehensive theory in order to understand why it is that something was justified, that this was justified. The U.S.'s narrative is, and this is likely to be the narrative in other theoretical frameworks of international relations theories, that the United States was protecting itself because it was concerned that the spread of communism was occurring. It was in the middle of the Cold War, as I described, and this was a concern, and so the U.S. was taking, as a realist would likely say, rational measures to ensure that it was protecting itself. However, in this case, I believe that a psychologist, Ashish Nandy, who was quoted in our textbook, explains that when you analyze from the perspective of the marginalized, from the perspective of the colonized, it offers, quote, a fuller picture of the structure and workings of the world. And I think it's very important to understand that this is a larger issue than a fight against communism. This is a example, just another example of America asserting its imperialist tendencies through an ethnocentric sense of superiority, the sense that America is entitled to prescribe its own desires and wills on countries of Latin America as it so chooses. And it's really important, I think, to study this case from a post-colonialist lens for that reason. It's the most telling and compelling way of understanding what is going on here. And again, it's imperial oppression, a perfect example of imperial oppression. Now, the disadvantages of using this theoretical framework in trying to understand how it was that the U.S. justified itself in going into and engaging with the politics of Chile. A disadvantage that I came up with is that it does leave out other narratives, right? So the narrative that I described, the Western perspective, which is likely to offer a different viewpoint, that the United States was taking a precaution in its own desires to promote democracy, which is actually kind of ironic because one of the fundamental principles of democracy is a democratic election, and they were deliberately overthrowing what was a democratically elected president. But that democracy promotion was paramount. It was the middle of the Cold War, and that was their strategic interest, and that it was the rational move. So focusing in this way on the marginalized voices, which I think is absolutely paramount, the colonial legacies that are at play here, does leave out the Western narrative, or the narrative that was aforementioned that I described. Nonetheless, though, I think that this is the most compelling standard to view in order and to study this case of U.S. intervention in order to get, as Nandi explains, a compelling perspective on the true structure and nature of the world. So I'm looking forward to doing this paper, and thank you very much for listening, Professor.